We are the Center for Advancing Health Outcomes. Research that transforms care, policy, practice, lives. Visit us at advancinghealth.ca.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the work in progress today, featuring work by the Center for Advancing Health Outcomes. A great presentation today, co-presented by Dr. Nick Bansback and Alex Tam. Brief introduction is Nick Bansback is a professor in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, leads the decision scientists at Advancing Health Outcomes, has a background in health economics, and seeks to improve the value patients and the public gain from a health and healthcare system. And Alex Tam is a research manager at Advancing Health and has a background in public health. And I just recently learned will be starting his PhD working with Nick this fall. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Bansback and Nick. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is going to be a bit of a two-parter, and I'll just sort of introduce the topic, then let Alex sort of present the first part of this work, and I'll present the second part. But just to sort of acknowledge, I'm at UBC today on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam. This work was done sort of in broader Vancouver, so acknowledging the unceded territories of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations as well. And I think acknowledgement is important because one of the topics in this study is about who do we include in clinical trials. And there's a question that we're not going to answer today, but I want to bring up in sort of future discussions about who are we including? Are they including Indigenous people? How's the relevance of clinical trials for all Canadians? So just briefly disclosing, the studies today were funded by CHR and the Arthritis Foundation, and we've got no other relationships. So I think for this audience, I don't need to convince you that clinical trials are important, and they will continue to be important moving forward. Large investments in clinical trials in Canada, recognizing this. We're going to talk about sort of failure today. And I just want to clarify, when I talk about the term failure, I'm not meaning a trial that recruits successfully and then finds that actually its primary endpoint is not met, because that's inference. That can be useful. That can tell you that a treatment isn't useful for moving forward. When we're talking about sort of failure, we're talking about a clinical trial that starts and then for some reason doesn't end in such a way that answers the question that is being posed of the trial. And when you look at this failure, there's got various reasons, but the enrollment of sufficient patients is said to be the key reason for clinical trial failure. And low enrollment is a disaster. It means that your trial often won't have the statistical power that will allow you to answer the question that the trial's trying to ask. And then if that happens, you've exposed patients potentially to risks associated with the intervention for no benefit or little benefit, not the benefit that you're hoping for. It wastes research dollars. Those are patients that could have been recruited into other studies, and there's all sorts of ethical questions around it. And studies that have done sort of maybe 10 years ago now in the US and UK have estimated that the proportion of trials that sort of fail because of low enrollment is between sort of 19 and 37%. But we actually don't know what's going on in Canada and how's that working. So Alex will present the problem with low enrollment as the first study in this presentation. And then thinking through that problem, why does it happen? And if you look at research grants, I've been part of many research of clinical trials and grants for clinical trials, reviewed them as well. Like the typical section of a grant that talks about how enrollment will occur, they'll say something like, you know, we see 100 patients per month and we conservatively estimate 10% would enroll. Or they'll say a pilot study recruited 10 patients in a month, so extrapolating to other sites over 1 year, we estimate, you know, we'll get this many patients. And you can kind of see that there's a challenge with those ways of estimating enrollment, and it's maybe not surprising that trials don't enroll as they intend. And so there's been quite a lot of research around sort of recruitment and enrollment in trials, but actually relatively little research actually asking the potential participants in the clinical trial about why they would enroll and what are the barriers and facilitators. And the research that has been done is mostly qualitative, doesn't actually help quantify what to do about that necessarily. And then when you see what the consequence of low enrollment is, it's one of the main factors that actually seems to exacerbate exclusion of underrepresented populations. When you're low on recruitment, you kind of get to a point where you're like, recruit anybody. And that means you'll typically recruit the most easy to recruit population. And that is one of the reasons that leads to us having clinical trials that often don't represent important populations, meaning that we don't know if the treatment works the same, better, or worse in those populations, which has all sorts of consequential impacts. So the second study that I will talk about is how can patients help inform sort of modifiable design decisions for clinical trials such that we can increase enrollment. So that's the setup. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to Alex to talk about the first study.
Yeah, so this first part covers a paper that we're working on. It's an analysis of trial registration information on clinicaltrials.gov. And to restate our objective for this first paper that I'm talking about, we wanted to determine the extent to which clinical trials in Canada do not recruit and enroll their intended or the stated number of participants at the trial offset. Then we wanted to identify aspects of trial design that were associated with accrual into trials, all the while considering the influence of funding source on those two objectives. So to answer that question, we turn to three sources of data: the clinicaltrials.gov registry, which is a website and publicly available database maintained by the National Library of Medicine. It houses researcher-submitted information about clinical research studies. It is more US-centric, but the database does house information from about 200 countries. And we downloaded a snapshot of this database that can be retrieved freely from the aggregate analysis of clinicaltrials.gov database, just so we had a consistent source of truth. Then we used two databases to help with identifying the funding source and funding statements. Firstly, we considered the PubMed database and retrieved studies associated with the completed trials. And we used the CIHR funding decisions database to identify project titles and study investigators who were funded by CIHR. Within clinicaltrials.gov, each study or trial is assigned an identifier called the NCT ID. We filtered the identifiers that were registered as an interventional trial with at least one study site in Canada, and at the time of data extraction, reported a study status of completed, terminated, or suspended. We also restricted the selection of trials to ones that began after January 2017. This is done because when we reviewed the policy history regarding registration requirements, this month and date and year came up as the latest date on which the requirements were updated. So we expected that the registration details in the database were reasonably more consistent for trials that were registered after this point in time. We also require trials to be described as phase 3 trials, or trials that couldn't be described using the conventional phases that FDA would accept. So such as trials related to screening, or trials that are not about products, maybe about programs and exercise programs. After some data exploration, we also excluded trials that began between 2022 and 2024, and trials that were terminated early for futility, safety, or committee recommendation-related reasons. And one of the advantages and challenges with this database is that the data could be updated essentially at any time, including information on enrollment counts. We wanted to compare the registered intended or the stated enrollment versus the actual enrollment at the time of data extraction. We settled on using the version of the NCTID right before the trial status was changed in the database from an inactive state, not yet recruiting, to an active state for the first time. We assume that this T-1 version would approximate a finalized target for enrollment. However, some trials had very sparse history, such as going from inactive to complete. And in those cases, that meant comparing the first version of the trial registration details to the latest version. Oops. We took the ratio of the actual versus intended or the stated enrollment counts and applied a threshold of greater than or equal to 0.85 to indicate recruitment success in our base scenario. This was informed by a similar study from Carlisle and colleagues that was similarly designed using ct.gov. And we looked at the number of trial level factors to explore through regression analysis. Turning to our results, we identified 2,213 trials that met our inclusion, in which 950,315 participants were enrolled into. 31% of these trials were unsuccessful using that 85% threshold for defining success. And this corresponded to just over 130,000 participants being recruited into trials that went on to be unsuccessful with recruitment. Here we have a plot of the proportion of trials with successful recruitment across different starting years and split out by funding. The top pinkish salmon line corresponds to privately funded trials. The forest green line corresponds to trials funded publicly aside from federal sources. And the cyan line below corresponds to federally funded trials. So as a whole, we can see that a greater proportion of privately funded trials succeed with their recruitment compared to public or federally funded ones. And this was the case regardless of which starting year that we looked at. Then moving into a multivariable logistic regression, here I show the adjusted odds ratios from the model. Several design level variables were associated with recruitment success. And let's just start from the top. Trials with higher initial targets for a number of participants were less likely to be successful in their recruitment compared to trials aiming to recruit fewer participants. Trials offering remote participation were more likely to be successful than trials with one physical site. Trials having more than 2 arms or trials having an active or placebo as the comparator arm were also more likely to be successful relative to single arm studies or studies that employed non-active comparator arms. Trials that intended to have follow-up beyond 1 year were less likely to be successful compared to trials with relatively short follow-up of under 3 months. And at least the pattern for eligibility criteria suggested that more criteria was potentially associated with being less likely to be successful, though not statistically significant in most comparisons. And when we break this out into separate models by funding source, the patterning of the associations and the directions of the results did not change much. So regardless of where the funding for the trial came from, these relationships between design and recruitment success were generally similar across the board. So some conclusions here. Nearly 1 in 3 clinical trials in Canada failed to enroll the stated number of participants. And I really want to re-emphasize this point that trials that fail to recruit and enroll are not necessarily failures. Some can still meet statistical inference on primary endpoints. Some can provide useful information on secondary endpoints. And some may be able to tell us more about the safety of the interventions. Other limitations with respect to how we interpret that number is the lack of context. We can't dig into the specific challenges and the reasons for recruitment failure. The literature would suggest that something like the target population is a really key determinant in success versus failure and the challenges associated with that population. As well as the design variables that we included in our analysis were non-exhaustive. There is really rich information inside clinicaltrials.gov in the form of free text fields across the database that we haven't accounted for. Nonetheless, we did find that several modifiable aspects of design were associated with success, such as trials that did not require travel to a physical site. But how important are some of these modifiable aspects from the patient perspective? For that, I'll pass back to Nick to provide his insights.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And a shout out to Jack Smith for all the hard work he did trawling through clinicaltrials.gov. Let's see if I can control this. So let me now sort of switch to sort of, well, this is I think a problem if around sort of 1 in 3 publicly funded studies are potentially failing because of lack of enrollment. I think just to kind of consider that doesn't include trials that have been extended and cost money for extensions to sort of meet their recruitment. So there's other factors going on here. So save your questions for Alex at the end on that study. This is a study that is trying to consider sort of how can we listen to patients and understand why they may or may not enroll in a trial and how that may influence the clinical trial design. The context for this study is a colleague of mine, Liana Frankel at Yale, who I've worked with for many years, is one of the advisors to the Arthritis Foundation in the US, who are concerned about their investment in clinical trials, as many funders are, where if they're investing a large amount of money and then finding that the trial doesn't actually meet its endpoints because of enrollment, that's a huge deal for their investment. And so we were sort of linked with a team led by Elena Lacina at Brigham and Women's and Harvard, who are conducting a study funded by the Arthritis Foundation, and were sort of willing to sort of work with us to sort of understand how they could potentially design their trial to be more acceptable for patients. So the objective of this particular part of the work was to sort of understand what is modifiable, but to go beyond that by just sort of understanding what's important by actually quantifying what the expected increases and decreases in enrollment might be expected with different designs. The case study, so this is the trial that the Arthritis Foundation had funded Brigham and Harvard to do, and it's around something called post-traumatic osteoarthritis, particularly in individuals who've sustained ACL injury, who are at much higher risk of developing knee osteoarthritis. And there's been a lot of work done to sort of try and find ways to sort of reduce this development of knee OA, and potential treatments include sort of injections and oral medications. And the trial that the Arthritis Foundation has funded is actually a trial of metformin. And when you start thinking through this study, so this is a treatment that if you're going to participate in a trial, if you're assigned to the intervention arm, it's a treatment that may reduce future development of OA, but you may not even develop OA at all. And at the same time, it may cause side effects. And so that's a pretty difficult trial to recruit for. I think hence the concerns of the funder and keenness for the investigators to understand what factors might be useful for enrollment. So the work went in 2 phases, as most of this type of work does. The first work phase has been sort of published, and it was led by the amazing Adam Easterbrook, a scientist at Advancing Health and qualitative researcher, who spent time listening to potential participants, actually spoke and interviewed 25 individuals with ACL injury who would be eligible for the trial. And in brief, lots of things came up that actually the investigators did not appreciate. Some things they were sort of not surprised about. Obviously, concerns about chance of benefit and side effects being part of the trial. And then sort of concerns about sort of like the pill size and the frequency of using metformin. But if you think about those 2 sort of factors, they're for me not particularly modifiable in a sense of a study that's been funded to look at metformin. Potentially they could look into changing the pill size, but that's maybe not within their ability within a trial. So those are things that we think are, they're important, but they're maybe not things that the design of the trial can actually change. The things that could be modifiable, things like the time commitment that were required was a concern, the distance to the site, the inclusiveness, which included sort of who the study coordinators and people involved in the study, did they kind of look like you, and whether you felt invited. And then the invitation itself, who it came from. Was it from your sort of surgeon who'd done your ACL surgery, or was it from a study coordinator? How was that done? And there are other factors that came up. So based on the qualitative work, we developed a survey, and we recruited people to do this survey, mostly from the academic medical centers. That would be the way they would typically recruit for this trial. But recognizing that one of the challenges with recruitment is that there's a sampling issue with their recruitment by just doing it in this way. So we supplemented the sample by going to sort of various online forums to try and find a more sort of diverse sample as well. We paid people to participate, and the inclusion criteria is there. And the survey, I won't go into in length, I haven't got time, but it's quite a long survey that included information and knowledge checks around ACL and osteoarthritis, asked all sorts of questions before it came to what we call a discrete choice question, which looked a bit like this. It asked people whether they would be willing to participate in sort of hypothetical trials or not participate in either. And this would be an example of one question, and then the levels of each of these attributes would change, and they'd be asked repeated questions such as this. And the idea is that by asking these repeated questions and running regression, we can sort of tease out and understand the relative importance of the different levels and of each of these attributes. So the attributes we ended up using were some of these things were not modifiable, but we decided they're so important and they give you some context for these sort of modifiable aspects. So effectiveness was in there, and actually that was individualized based on responses from the patient, which gave individualized proposed effectiveness reductions based on their characteristics. Side effects, which range from sort of a mild to these very small but quite significant side effects with metformin. And then we asked things about who invites you to the trial, what happens at the end of the trial. For example, one thing that came up was maybe if you were assigned to placebo, potentially then if the medication was shown to be effective, you would get free treatment for some time after the study. Compensation per visit. Other benefits such as sort of routine MRI and physiotherapy, distance to study visits, and sort of inclusiveness. So jumping to the results, we were able to sort of recruit 268 individuals, and these are sort of the demographics, and they are kind of what we would expect from the sample. So we're fairly happy with who we recruited. And then interestingly, it just showed that these are people most of them were post ACL injury for some time, but they're still aware of their knee problem daily, so 40%. Even if it's not pain, they're aware of their injury. And so what did the results show? So in this figure, you'll see there's a 0 line here on the x-axis. And these first results here are for the effectiveness. And so the reference is for low. And so this is comparing mid to low, that people are would prefer to participate in a trial if it had this middle level of effectiveness compared to low effectiveness. But they would prefer even more to participate in a trial that has high versus low effectiveness. So that's kind of what you would expect. Then in terms of side effects, this goes the other direction. So any side effect compared to none would be detract somebody from wanting to participate in the trial. And if you look at the size of these bars, they are sort of relative to each other. So you can see there that the size of the bar for sort of high effectiveness is similar to the size of side effect, to sort of like almost count each other out. But what's interesting, was somewhat surprising to our investigators, was that it didn't really matter what the side effect was. So a mild side effect, which the investigators thought was relatively insignificant, actually was as important as these very rare severe side effects. So that was one sort of important learning for the trial team. If we go on to some of the other factors, they were less important relatively to these things. But then compensation is actually very important. So this is the importance of per visit $25 and $50 versus 0. So that those bars are bigger than the side effects and the effectiveness. But then relatively sort of the MRI and scans were important, as were like 30 minutes to a site seemed to be important, but a 60-minute distance was somewhat, you can see relatively half the amount of importance to the side effect. And then inclusiveness and what happens at the end of the trial didn't seem to have huge effects overall. So these are the results for everybody averaged. One of the things that we can do with this analysis is actually run what we call like a latent class to try and understand if there's subgroups of people with different preferences. We actually found nearly 80% of our respondents sort of fell into a class on the left-hand side, which is called class 1. And you can see that, again, these are kind of relative to each other. You can see that kind of compensation is the main driver here, but actually none of the other attributes seem to be as important. Interestingly though, class 1 were overall, irrespective of these attributes, more willing to participate in a trial. And that aligned to a separate question that we asked them. They'd answered a question saying they were quite motivated to participate because they wanted to help others. Class 2 were not as motivated to participate. And so their attributes are slightly different. You see here that side effects are far more important for class 2. But you also see things like an invitation from a coordinator by phone or email seem to be quite important to class 2, as were the free MRI scans. And even you can see down there in class 2 sort of the inclusiveness bar is somewhat important in comparison to class 1. So how do you make meaning of all this? So the last thing I'll show you is our predictions. So we can create a sort of like a base case where we kind of come up with what is a sort of a base case sort of trial. Here I've defined it by choosing one level of each attribute. So this is like a medium effectiveness treatment with mild side effects, invitation by doctor, no placebo effects, no financial compensation. You can see that's the baseline. And that gives us a sort of a number of around sort of like 30% of individuals saying that they would be willing to be interested in this trial. If we then change the level of one of those attributes at a time, we can see the incremental impact of people's sort of interest in it, in participating. And so those blue bars are those. So you see here, overall, the invitation from the research coordinator is only going to add 1 in 100, whereas via phone or email is 4 in 100. But then you see the compensation, and that actually is much larger. But the point here is that to actually change your clinical trial design costs you something different. So how much it costs to have a research coordinator doing phone calls is a cost that you can compare against this 4%, whereas this compensation of $50 per visit, you know, you can work out how much more that would cost you for the number of people in your trial and the number of visits, and weigh up whether that is actually a useful, a good value for money in terms of modifying your trial design. Just the other attributes here, you can see the impact of MRI and physiotherapy, and then the shortening distance to site. So just that would be a way of indicating whether more sites around sort of like another population that would potentially increase your participation. It gives you sort of estimates of how many more people you might expect to enroll. And you can then do that by these latent classes. So I won't go into these, but you can see how these vary. And I think one thing that I didn't mention in the last slide, it's a little bit disappointing for us. We were sort of hoping that these classes would distinguish sort of some socioeconomic difference between the classes, like age or ethnicity or something that would help us sort of show that argument. But the idea is that you could, if you found that there were classes associated with different sort of socio-demographics of populations that you were very keen to enroll, it would help you design the trial such that those populations would be more willing to enroll in your study. So that's the idea of this latent class analysis. So I'm going to wrap up so we can have some questions. I think just one thing before I go into this, I think our results here are very specific for this particular trial. So I'm not trying to say that any of this should be translated to other studies. This was done in the US as well. So please don't interpret the results of this study as in any way for your studies. It probably would, I'm sure it will vary based on the sort of population and the kind of trial and the intervention that you are considering. There's some other limitations, and that is like response bias. You know, you have an issue with people participating in a clinical trial. We have issues with recruiting people to participate in a survey. I guess the idea here is that the reach we have for people willing to participate in a survey is larger than the reach who might participate in the clinical trial. So you're potentially going to be asking people in this survey who are these maybes, what might make you actually participate. So I think that's sort of like, but it's a genuine sort of like concern with this approach. And the DCE, you know, it's crude, it doesn't capture all the nuances of the intervention, but it kind of just gives you sort of an overall description. And as much as we tried to help people understand what was going on with all these attributes, I still have concerns about sort of like whether people really understand what being given placebo really means. And so I think there's some of the results we need to be kind of interpret with caution. And then our inclusiveness, you know, it didn't really show results on this that might be useful, but probably due to our sampling strategy and sample size. So if we're going to do this again, I think we would sort of really think carefully about how to recruit not representative, but actually really think through how we'd be more inclusive in targeting people to participate in our study. So we think this is a promising approach. We think it can do better than what we can inform people right now on clinical trial design. Recognize that sort of motivations to participate are heterogeneous. Like some people are motivated by some things and some other trial design features. We're finding in this study that compensation is important, and that's actually something that the trial team have taken on board. But I think other factors that we thought were important actually are more difficult. In this trial, for them to add a new site is actually quite difficult and quite expensive. So that the relative benefit for doing that was considered not worthwhile. But I think that's the strength of this approach, is that it can help you understand what the cost of implementation versus the cost of how many, well, in terms of the number of people you might actually help increase enrollment. And I think this is an area of interest. FDA has been writing new guidance on how to facilitate enrollment and minimize burden, and there's a greater understanding of patient preferences and trade-offs. There's certainly interest in the US, and our work has gone down very well with our partners down there. But I guess we're pretty keen to sort of see if we can help people in Canada do better clinical trials. And so we'd really like to sort of, this is sort of my pitch, we'd really like to test to see if this approach actually works. So there's some things we need to do on the approach. We need to be quick. Like, we realize the time from when a trial is proposed to when it's designed is short, and we need to be able to do this really efficiently and quickly if we're going to have impact. So that's something that we're working on. But we need to then think about, how do we actually compare whether this works, like conventional versus this sort of patient-informed approach. And we're thinking there's ways we could do a pre-post comparison. If there's been consecutive trials in similar populations with a similar intervention, we could sort of test whether the design of the pre without a change with the post with this patient-informed approach, does that change the enrollment? Or we could do a sort of like a cluster randomized sort of study within a trial, a SWOT is what they're called, where we actually test different designs across sites. We just think through the ethics of doing that and whether different designs would actually potentially bias your results. But that's an idea that we'd love to explore. If anyone has other ideas, love to hear it. We're keen to sort of put a CHR grant together on the methods of this, and we'd love for people who are developing clinical trials, who are early stage, potentially who are kind of maybe worried about enrollment, and would like to sort of use this approach. If you would be willing to collaborate, then please let us know. But with that, I'm going to finish off. There are our email, and I'll be happy, or Alex and I will be happy to answer any questions.